We learned later that a firing range was accessible. It would afford us an opportunity to familiarize ourselves with our individual weapons and to zero them into a pinpoint accuracy. This was we did for the next several days. The weather was mild, 50 to 60 degrees during the day, and at night would drop down to 35 or 40 degrees. The sun was never in abundance, but most of the days were overcast with low-lying cumulus clouds lingering about. Rain also was a constant factor to reckon with on a daily basis, for when it rained, it came down in buckets.
Stand on what?
When it rained, it came down in buckets, usually 1 to 3 inches at a time. The goodness of our hotel billets stayed dry during it all, and we were thankful for that. Along with the issue of weapons, we also supplied numerous clothing rations, including 2 pairs of woolen gloves, mittens and finger, long johns, long-sleeved undershirts, and 6 pairs of wool socks, an extra pair of combat boots, a pair of 4-buckled galoshes, and a double wool blanket sleeping bag with their names and serial numbers stenciled in the outer section's cover. In addition to the above-mentioned issue, we also received extra shorts, handkerchief, and an extra pair of ODs and fatigues. We were also issued new webbing, pistol and cartridge, trench knife, shelter half, and full field pack, and a raincoat and a poncho. How would you carry all this stuff? You got
In a Jeep or a trailer.
Oh my God. Our helmet liners had our names stenciled in the front, but our steel helmets were left untouched with the exception of the officers who had a narrow white band painted on the rear of theirs. Our Form 20s were reviewed, shots brought up to date, and allotments, if any, reviewed and changed, if so desired, as well as our insurance beneficiaries and the notice of the next of kin. All this was taken care of with the first few days at the arrival in the theater. It was eerie but necessary. All during our brief stay at Wales, our TO, Table of Organization, was brought up to where it should be several months ago. Captain Drewlord was still the company commander, CO. Sergeant Whalen was still first sergeant, and Sergeant Rupert was our platoon sergeant. We still had no platoon leader, even though Fink had been the squad leader before we left the States. He still had not received his sergeant's stripes. I was the first gunner, Lape was the assistant gunner, and Varela and Jensen were ammo bearers, which the rest of the squad to be filled in at a later date. All in all, we still had approximately 10 to 15 men under strength in the platoon, and I hope our remaining days would bring us up to strength. After the first week, we once again fell into a routine of sorts, much unlike anything we experienced back in the States. In the States, we were isolated. Here, we were in the center of town, in the midst of civilians, living in the very same town occupied by them. As such, there was not much complaining, as everyone in the back of their minds could relate to much more trying and devastating circumstances in the near future. I pulled fire watch the third day, and we were in our billets, and substantially twice more before we left. This was nothing more than a monitoring and tending to fireplaces in the various rooms in the building. It was much similar to guard duty, as we were 2 hours and a half off, 4 hours to rest, sleep, or whatever. It was only during the nighttime as the men slept. I usually got a 200 to 400 hour tour, and this was then off to the rest of the detail. What entailed was all the fireplaces on the ground floor, which numbered about 10, seeing that there were no fire hazards about and generally keeping the coals burning until morning. No fireplaces were active during the daylight hours, unless there was someone in constant attendance. Due to the conditions of the wooden buildings and their close proximity to one another, the imminent danger of fire was uppermost in everyone's minds. Luckily, we went through our stay at the billets without a single incident of fire. We kept on top of our house cleaning for the express purpose to keep clear anything that would remotely cause a fire. The condition of the buildings was deplorable, and most of us wondered how the Army could be so cavalier as it kept occupying them. They probably said much for how we rated in the higher scheme of things. We still had not gotten our full complement of people, and our leadership function left much to be desired. All the officers and senior non-coms we're trained with were gone, not through attrition, but through their own volition. It still did not feel that we were actually really suited or ready for the rigors of combat. We were not cohesive, integral unit functioning as a team. There was much friction and instability among the squads and platoons, and even in the company. Captain Drewler was aloof and incapable of instilling in men he commanded any semblance of leadership of the unit cohesion. The other officers were almost non-existent, as when we'd obtain one or two, they did not last long for various reasons. The men themselves were mostly divided between former ASTP, Air Corps, and regular draftees and enlistees. Naturally, the ASTP and Air Corps were the elite and were always looking for that special privilege and non-toiling assignments. I did not believe that I could trust my life in their hands, since they are always so self-centered and aggressive in what they believed was their place in the scheme of things. Steve, and then after that you put Steve.
Yeah.
Did you get it, Jen?
Yeah.
You put Steve.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, you said it was like Steve, exclamation mark.
Yeah.
You remember doing that?
Yeah.
Our squad was probably the exception. I thought although we had both Fink and Lape, we were both ASTP, but their personalities and beliefs were the exception rather than a rule. Fink was a fortunate guy who just fortunate to get into ASTP. He always commented so many times, no big deal, and abided by the maxim. Lape, on the other hand, while not flaunting his good fortune to be an ASTP, displayed a strong affinity for believing his superior to the rest of us. He would always try to intellectualize every facet of our existence. The only thing that would keep him in check was his constant follow-ups and complete ineptness at soldiering. The Western squad were draftees, usually apathetic and forlorn. They did what they told, but did not relish what they were doing, and only looked up for the day they could get out of the Army and the war. I never discussed these issues with anyone, primarily since I believed I would do no good. But we would only antagonize certain individuals and make them even more rigid in their performance. I felt this was ever since coming into the 75th with the short experiences with the 106th. I only felt it more strongly. At one time I thought seriously of transferring into a special unit where there were all volunteers and who would consequently display more team spirit and a spirit de corps. But much like what I deliberated, I never did any substantial about it. They were posted on the company boulevard, forthcoming dance at the local canteen. British for USO. No passes were issued, since only requisite you would sign in and sign out at the orderly room, provided you were not in some type of detail. The orderly room was in the headquarters platoon building, several streets away from our shower area, which made it convenient to shave and shower, sign out, and take in the sights of the town without the extra hassles of riding buses for hours, and we did in Breckenridge. Granted, the walk was somewhat a nuisance, but it was well worth it for the hot shower that we would partake of. It was only a few things of which the Army had provided itself quite capable of achieving. The canteen was a former auditorium of sorts, situated at the opposite end of town, approximately a mile and a half from the billets. It was easily to find, as we had to go down Milford Road to Maryland Road, and then turn left on Freeman's Way until we got to Howells Avenue. The auditorium sat at the end of Howells Avenue. Considering the size of the town, 35,000 population, the canteen and dance floor was rather large. The dance floor was in the center of a large room with a space for the orchestra to one side. Along one outer wall were clusters of small tables and chairs, and at the end of the wall was a U-shaped bar which served warm English beer, sodas, tea, biscuits, and cookies. The other wall encompassed an entrance clothing check counter and presumably the chatting area where you greeted your escort or got acquainted with one. As Fink and Leap, I returned, there were already many GIs mingling about with the RAF and British soldiers. What struck us gratifying was the abundance of females, all young and somewhat attractive in their British attire. I thought of Anne and felt somewhat of self-conscious as it was looked upon the collection of young women. Fink began to circulate, and Leap kept following me as I wandered about. While the band struck up another trio of tunes, the girls were well-mannered and reserved, as British are noted for. As I walked about, I was greeted with a warm hello yank, or just hello, and never a hi. The girls were from several villages, and they all seemed exhilarated and pleased to be among strangers from another country. As I stood and watched the dancing, Leip kept pestering me to start circulating and make some contacts. I ignored his persistence since I had no intention in actually dancing with someone. I felt that I was mystically engaged, and this was forbidding and precept of Anne's and my relationship. The band took a short break, and Leip and I walked over to the bar to taste our first English beer. It was flat, and worst of all, it was warm. After several sips, I laid the glass down and walked away. Leip thought it tasted great and had another, so it was horrible, huh?
Yeah.
He followed me, glass in hand, eyeing all the girls as we passed them. I did not particularly notice anyone, but thought of Anne and our first dance together, and I compared Anne with the girls here, and I thought there was no comparison. Anne had them beat by a mile. The band struck up again with a familiar hokey pokey. Leip and I walked over to the dance floor and watched the GIs dance the hokey pokey with the British lassies. As we stood there watching, someone tapped me on the shoulder. As I turned, there was a girl smiling at me and asking if I cared to dance. Before I could form a reaction, I said yes, smiled back at her, and led her onto the dance floor. I am no great dancer, and the ins and outs of the hokey pokey had me going every which way, much to the joy and pleasure of my female companion. She seemed enjoying anticipating my missteps and following with a correct sequence. I was beginning to enjoy myself and fell into a mood of music, trying to stay with the music and at the same time get acquainted with my newfound friend. We had little time for small talk, as it took my powers of concentration for my dancing, following my companion and still not being too clumsy and left-footed. Finally, when the number was completed, I escorted her to the bar for something to drink, and we both agreed on soda. As we sat at one table, she told me her name was Jean, and I made the remark that we were the two J's, and my first name was John. She liked the comparison and acknowledged with a smile as she crossed her legs and sipped on her soda. Leip sauntered over the table and kept gawking and smiling as if he wanted part of the action. I was a little perturbed at his behavior, and when the music started up again, I asked Jean if she would care to dance. She got up and walked over to the dance floor. Lucky was a slow foxtrot and something I could handle. I felt strange holding someone else besides Anne, as all old positions somehow did not mesh, and I felt awkward and inept. As we danced, I found myself concentrating on what I was saying. It was difficult to comprehend parts of her speech. It was all due to her thick Welsh accent, as many of her words and phrases had different meanings and connotations from what I was familiar with. I was fascinated with her accent and thought it was most worldly and sophisticated. So that's the end of chapter 7. That's the end of chapter 7. I'm going to take a break for a minute and have a drink.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a break for a minute and have a drink.